The carriage wheels clattered over stone as Princess Ilara pressed her palm against the cold glass, watching her kingdom disappear into the mist behind her. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon when they'd departed, and now the light was fading into something else entirely, a perpetual twilight that seemed to swallow the road ahead. This was the boundary between the human realm of Astoria and the vampire territories of Nocturna, where daylight grew timid and shadows learned to breathe. She wore black, as tradition demanded. The mourning gown was meant to symbolize the death of her old life, though Ilara thought it might as well symbolize her actual death. In 3 days' time, she would wed Lucian Draven, the Alpha Vampire King, and seal a treaty written in blood and desperation. Her lady-in-waiting, Margot, sat across from her with red-rimmed eyes. The older woman had been crying since they'd left the palace gates, though she tried to hide it behind an embroidered handkerchief. Ilara couldn't afford such luxuries. She'd cried all her tears the night her father had told her of the arrangement, standing in his war room with maps of their dying kingdom spread before them like autopsy reports. "The vampires have agreed to protect our borders from the Shadowlands," her father had said, unable to meet her eyes. "In exchange for a union between our houses. It's the only way, Ilara. The creatures from beyond the veil have already taken 3 villages. Our armies cannot fight on 2 fronts. Not against Duke Bastion's rebellion in the south and these things in the north." She had wanted to scream that she was not a bargaining chip, not a piece to be traded on a war table. But she'd seen the grey in her father's hair, the way his hands shook when he thought no one was looking. She'd walked through the refugee camps and held children who'd watched their parents dragged into the darkness. So instead of screaming, she'd curtsied and said, "As you wish, father." Now, as the carriage descended into a valley where the trees grew black and twisted, Ilara wondered if she'd traded one monster for another. The stories about Lucian Draven were the kind mothers told to frighten misbehaving children. They said he'd ruled Nocturna for 3 centuries, that he'd personally killed the last vampire queen by tearing out her heart, that he bathed in the blood of his enemies and kept their skulls as trophies. They said his eyes were red as fresh wounds, and that his voice could compel you to walk into your own death, smiling all the while. "My lady," Margot whispered, pulling Ilara from her dark thoughts. "Look." Through the mist, a structure emerged that made Ilara's breath catch. Castle Draven rose from the mountainside like a crown of thorns, all black stone and soaring spires that seemed to pierce the perpetual dusk. Gargoyles perched on every corner, their stone faces twisted in eternal agony or ecstasy. It was impossible to tell which. But what struck Ilara most was the beauty of it. She'd expected something grotesque, a monument to death and decay. Instead, the castle was hauntingly elegant, its Gothic architecture speaking of an aesthetic sophistication that contradicted every brutal tale she'd been told. The carriage passed through iron gates, wrought with symbols Ilara didn't recognize. Protection wards, perhaps, or warnings. The courtyard was immaculate, cobblestones swept clean, and torches burning with an eerie blue flame that cast no smoke. Servants in dark livery lined the entrance, pale and still as statues. When the carriage stopped, Ilara forced herself to breathe evenly. She was a princess of Astoria, descended from the dragon kings of old. She would not cower. A footman opened the door, and Ilara stepped out into air that smelled of night-blooming jasmine and something metallic she didn't want to name. The servants bowed as one, a choreographed movement that would have impressed the strictest courtmaster. "Princess Ilara of Astoria," a smooth voice announced. "Welcome to Castle Draven." The speaker was a woman who looked perhaps 30, though Ilara knew better than to trust appearances here. She had midnight black hair, pinned in an elaborate style, and wore a gown of deep burgundy that looked like it had been stolen from a more decadent century. Her eyes were grey, not red, and her smile was practiced, but not unkind. "I am Lady Seraphine, the King's Seneschal. His Majesty awaits you in the formal receiving room. If you'll follow me?" Ilara nodded, gesturing for Margot to stay close. They entered the castle through doors that seemed to open of their own accord, into an entrance hall that stole what little breath Ilara had left. The ceiling soared 3 stories high, painted with murals of stars and celestial bodies in such detail they seemed to move. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls, and the marble floor reflected everything like dark water. But it was the portrait that dominated the hall that made Ilara stop. It showed a man, the man she would marry, painted with such skill that his eyes seemed to follow her. He was beautiful in the way storms were beautiful, all sharp angles and aristocratic features framed by black hair that fell past his shoulders. His eyes in the painting were not red, but a deep amber, almost gold, and there was something in his expression that contradicted the monster she'd expected. He looked tired, ancient and weary, as if he'd seen too much and wished to see less. "That was painted 200 years ago," Lady Seraphine said softly. "The artist was considered the finest in all the realms. The king sat for 3 nights, though he claimed it was vanity and a waste of time." She paused. "He looks much the same now. We do not change, Princess. Not in the ways humans do." They walked through corridors lined with more artwork, through rooms filled with books and strange instruments Ilara couldn't name. The castle was not the charnel house she'd imagined. It was a palace, refined and cultured, with an air of melancholy that seemed to seep from the very stones. Finally, they reached a set of double doors carved with images of wolves and ravens. Lady Seraphine knocked once, and a voice from within said, "Enter." The receiving room was smaller than Ilara expected, more intimate. A fire burned in a massive hearth, and the walls were lined with books. At the far end, standing before a window that looked out over mountains shrouded in mist, was Lucian Draven. He turned as they entered, and Ilara's hand instinctively went to the silver pendant at her throat, a protective charm her mother had given her years ago. But she didn't step back. The king of vampires was tall, perhaps 6.5 feet, with the same aristocratic features from the portrait. He wore black, as she did, but where her gown was heavy with grief, his clothes seemed to drink in the light. His hair was longer than in the painting, pulled back from his face, revealing eyes that were indeed not red. They were amber, flecked with gold, and as he studied her with an intensity that made her feel like prey, she saw something unexpected in them: curiosity. "Princess Ilara," he said, his voice a deep baritone that resonated in her chest. "You are not what I expected." She lifted her chin. "Nor are you, Your Majesty." His lips quirked in what might have been amusement. "You were expecting a monster." "I was expecting the monster from the stories, blood-soaked and savage." She met his gaze directly, refusing to look away first. "I see a man in expensive clothes standing in a room full of books. The truth, I suspect, is somewhere in between." For a moment, silence filled the room. Then Lucien Draven did something that shocked her more than any display of monstrous power could have. He laughed. It was a genuine sound, rich and surprised, as if he hadn't expected to be amused. "Your father said you were clever. I see he understated the matter." He gestured to a chair near the fire. "Please sit. Lady Seraphine, wine for our guest. I'd prefer to remain standing, Ilara said, though her legs were shaking beneath her skirts. As you wish. Lucien moved to pour wine himself, an action so at odds with his station that it caught her off guard. He offered her a crystal goblet. It's from your country, actually. A vineyard in the southern provinces. I'm told it's quite good, though I cannot taste it as you do. Ilara took the glass but didn't drink. You don't consume wine? I can. It simply has no savour for me. Only blood provides that particular pleasure. He said it matter-of-factly, watching her face for a reaction. Does my honesty disturb you? I appreciate it more than lies dressed as courtesy. She set the glass down on a nearby table. Your Majesty, let us speak plainly. I am here because my kingdom is desperate, and your armies are the only thing standing between my people and annihilation. You are getting a political alliance and a connection to the human realms. This marriage is a transaction. I don't expect love or even kindness, but I would ask for honesty between us, at least in private. Lucien studied her for a long moment, and Ilara thought she saw approval flicker across his features. Very well. Honesty it is. He set his own untouched glass aside. I did not wish for this marriage either, Princess. I have been alone for a very long time, and I chose that solitude. But my council insisted that we needed stronger ties to the human kingdoms, and your father's offer came at a convenient time. Because of the threats from the Shadowlands? Because my own kingdom grows restless. He moved to the window, and in profile, Ilara could see the weight he carried in the set of his shoulders. There are factions among my people who wish to expand our territories, to take human lands by force. They see your kingdoms as weak, divided by petty wars, and ruled by mortals whose lives flicker by like candle flames. This alliance gives me leverage to argue for peace. So we are both pawns in larger games, Ilara said softly. Yes. He turned back to her. But that does not mean we must be enemies, Princess. The marriage will take place in 3 days, as agreed. Until then, you are a guest in my home. I will not force my company upon you, nor will I demand anything beyond what our treaty requires. In public, we will play our parts. In private, he paused. In private, we can be honest. It was not a declaration of love, nor even of friendship, but it was more than Ilara had dared hope for. She nodded slowly. I can accept those terms. Good. Lucien moved toward the door, then stopped. One more thing, Princess. The stories you've heard about me. Some are true. I have lived a long time and done things I am not proud of. I have killed, conquered, and ruled with a firm hand because anything less in this world is seen as weakness. But I have never been cruel for cruelty's sake, and I have never harmed someone under my protection. His amber eyes locked onto hers. You are under my protection now. No one in this castle will harm you. You have my word. The word of a vampire king, Ilara said, not quite a question. The word of a man who has learned that honor is sometimes all that separates us from true monsters. Then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him, and Ilara was alone with Lady Seraphine and Margot, both of whom looked as stunned as she felt. The next 3 days passed in a strange dream. Ilara was given chambers in the eastern wing, rooms decorated in deep blues and silvers that overlooked a garden she couldn't quite believe existed. It was filled with night-blooming flowers and silver-leafed trees, beautiful and eerie in equal measure. Margot stayed with her, sleeping in the adjoining room, and servants attended to their every need with quiet efficiency. Ilara spent her days exploring the castle, always accompanied by either Lady Seraphine or one of the household guard. She discovered a library that put her father's collection to shame, with thousands of volumes in languages both familiar and foreign. There was a music room with instruments from across the centuries, a conservatory with plants she'd only read about in botanical texts, and a gallery of paintings that chronicled 300 years of history. But it was in the training yard that she found something unexpected. She'd been walking the battlements, trying to clear her head of pre-wedding anxiety, when she heard the clash of steel below. Curious, she descended a tower staircase and found herself overlooking a courtyard where two figures sparred with swords. One was a vampire she didn't recognize, tall and lean with movements too fast for human eyes to properly track. The other was Lucienne. Ilara had never seen anything like it. They moved like dancers, like water, each strike and parry flowing into the next, with a grace that defied the brutality of combat. But what caught her attention was the expression on Lucien's face, focused but not cruel, testing his opponent but not trying to humiliate. When the vampire stumbled, Lucien immediately stopped, offering his hand to help him up. "You're telegraphing your attacks with your shoulders," Lucien said, loud enough for Ilara to hear from her vantage point. "An observant opponent will read you before you strike." "Yes, my lord," the younger vampire said, breathless. "Shall we go again?" "Not today. You've improved significantly, Marcus. I'm pleased with your progress." The genuine warmth in his voice was so at odds with the ruthless king of legend that Ilara found herself leaning forward, trying to reconcile the two images. This was not a tyrant who ruled through fear. This was a teacher, patient and encouraging. As if sensing her presence, Lucienne looked up. Their eyes met across the distance, and for a moment, neither moved. Then he offered her a slight bow, an acknowledgement that sent an unexpected flutter through her chest. That evening, for the first time since her arrival, Lucienne requested her presence at dinner. Ilara dressed carefully, choosing a gown of deep emerald that had been provided by the castle's wardrobes. Margot fussed with her hair, pinning it up with silver combs that caught the candlelight. "You look beautiful, my lady," Margot said softly. "Like a queen." "I'm not a queen yet," Ilara replied, but she studied her reflection in the mirror and barely recognized herself. The woman looking back at her was poised, regal, and far braver than she felt. Dinner was served in a smaller dining room rather than the great hall, with only Lucienne, Ilara, and Lady Seraphine present. The table was set with silver and crystal, and the meal was entirely human food: roasted duck with herbs, fresh bread, vegetables in delicate sauces. "I wasn't sure what you preferred," Lucien said as they sat. "I hope this is acceptable." "It's lovely," Ilara said, surprised by the consideration. "But you won't be eating." "I will keep you company." He poured wine for her, water for himself. "Lady Seraphine tells me you've been exploring the castle." "With her permission. I hope I haven't intruded anywhere I shouldn't." "You are to be my wife. You have access to everything except the North Tower." He said it casually, but there was something in his tone that suggested that restriction was not negotiable. "The North Tower?" Ilara asked, her curiosity immediately piqued. "My private chambers, and below them, the vault where I keep—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Items of significant power and danger. It's sealed with wards that would kill even me if I attempted to breach them incorrectly. I tell you this not to frighten you, but so you understand. That place is forbidden for your safety, not as an arbitrary rule." Ilara nodded slowly. "I understand. Thank you for explaining." You've spent time in the library, Lady Seraphine interjected smoothly, steering the conversation. Have you found anything of interest? Actually, yes. Ilara set down her fork. I found a history of the vampire courts, written by someone named Theron the Chronicler. It mentioned the old wars between humans and vampires, but the accounts were so different from what I learned as a child. In our histories, vampires were always the aggressors, monsters who preyed on humanity for sport. But Theron writes of treaties broken by human kings, of vampire children hunted for bounties, of entire bloodlines wiped out in purges. Silence fell over the table. Lucian's expression was carefully neutral, but his hands had stilled on his glass. History is written by those with the power to shape it, he finally said. Your histories are not wrong, Princess. There were vampires who preyed on humans for sport, but they were not the only ones capable of cruelty. The wars began because both sides feared each other, and fear makes monsters of us all. Were you there? Ilara asked softly. During the wars? Yes. The single word carried centuries of weight. I fought in them, I killed in them, and I watched friends on both sides fall to blades and stake and fire. He met her eyes. I do not tell you this to upset you, but so you know what I am. I am not innocent, Ilara. I have done things that would horrify you. But I learned, in time, that peace requires more strength than war. That building is harder than destroying. Is that why you agreed to this marriage? Partly, and partly because... He stopped, seeming to wrestle with something. Because I am tired. 300 years of ruling, of making impossible decisions, of watching the world change while I remain the same. This alliance offers a chance for something different. I don't know what that is yet, but I'm willing to find out. The honesty in his voice was raw, vulnerable in a way Ilara hadn't expected. She found herself wanting to reach across the table to offer comfort, but she held herself back. They were still strangers, bound by politics rather than affection. I saw you training earlier, she said instead. In the courtyard. Lucien's lips quirked. Ah, I wondered if that was you on the battlements. Marcus is one of my youngest captains. He has potential but lacks confidence. Encouragement serves him better than criticism. That's not how most kings train their warriors. No, he agreed. Most rule through fear and punishment. I've found loyalty built on respect lasts longer. He tilted his head, studying her. You're surprised by that. I'm surprised by a lot of things about you, Ilara admitted. Nothing is as I expected. Are you disappointed? No, she said honestly. I'm hopeful, which frightens me more than disappointment would have. Understanding flickered in his amber eyes. Hope is dangerous. It makes us vulnerable. Then we're both in danger. The words hung between them, an acknowledgement of something neither was quite ready to name. Lady Seraphine cleared her throat delicately, breaking the spell. The wedding gown is ready for your final fitting tomorrow morning, Your Highness, she said to Ilara. And the ceremonial preparations are nearly complete. The union will take place in the Great Hall at midnight, as tradition demands. Midnight? Of course. Ilara nodded, pushing down the flutter of anxiety in her chest. I'll be ready. The rest of the meal passed in lighter conversation, discussions of books, music, the changing of seasons in ways that varied between human and vampire lands. Lucien was surprisingly well-read, able to discuss everything from ancient philosophy to modern agricultural techniques. He asked Ilara about her homeland, about her childhood, listening with genuine interest as she described growing up in the palace, learning statecraft from her father and healing from her mother. Your mother was a healer? Lucien asked. She was. She died 5 years ago, during the fever plague that swept through the capital. Ilara's voice remained steady, though the loss still ached. She treated the sick until she contracted it herself. My father wanted her to stop, to stay safe in the palace. But she said a queen's duty was to her people, even if it cost her everything. She sounds remarkable, Lucienne said softly. You have her courage, I think. Or her stubbornness. Sometimes they're the same thing. When dinner ended, Lucienne walked her back to her chambers personally, dismissing the guards, who moved to follow. They walked in comfortable silence through the torch-lit corridors until they reached her door. Tomorrow will be difficult, Lucienne said. The ceremony is intense. There are rituals involved that may seem strange or frightening. But I swear to you, you will not be harmed. Do you trust me enough for that? Ilara looked up at him, at this man who was trying so hard to be honest, to be kind, despite what he was. I'm choosing to, she said. Ask me again in a few days if I regret it. He smiled then, a real smile that softened his features and made him look almost human. Fair enough. Good night, Princess. Good night, Your Majesty. She watched him walk away, his footsteps silent on the stone floor, and realized with a start that she was no longer dreading the wedding. She was dreading disappointing him. The next day passed in a blur of preparations. The gown was magnificent. Black lace over ivory silk, with silver thread embroidered in patterns that looked like frost on glass. It was nothing like the white confections human brides wore, but Ilara loved it instantly. It made her look powerful, regal, ready to stand beside a king of darkness. The ceremony would be witnessed by the vampire court, Lucienne's council, and a small delegation from Astoria led by her father's most trusted ambassador. Ilara's father himself could not attend. Leaving the kingdom during wartime would be seen as abandonment. She tried not to feel hurt by his absence, tried to understand the impossible position he was in, but a small part of her wondered if he simply couldn't bear to watch. As midnight approached, Lady Seraphine and Margot helped her dress, arranging her hair in an elaborate crown of braids woven with silver wire and tiny diamonds that caught the light like stars. A veil of black lace completed the ensemble, covering her face but allowing her to see. You look like a queen, Margot whispered, tears streaming down her face. Oh, my lady, you look like a warrior queen from the old songs. Don't cry, Ilara said, though her own throat was tight. This isn't goodbye. Isn't it? Margot's voice broke. You'll be one of them now. Changed, different. The marriage doesn't make me a vampire, Margot. I'm still me, still human. That was part of the treaty. I remain as I am. But even as she said it, Ilara wondered if that was entirely true. How could she remain unchanged, living in this place, married to a man who had seen empires rise and fall? The great hall had been transformed. Thousands of candles burned in silver holders, casting dancing shadows on walls draped in black and silver cloth. The vampire court stood on one side, pale and beautiful and utterly inhuman, their eyes gleaming in the candlelight. The human delegation huddled on the other side, looking small and vulnerable in comparison. And at the front, on a dais before an altar carved from black stone, stood Lucienne. He wore formal regalia, a long coat of black brocade with silver fastenings, a high collar, his hair loose around his shoulders. A circlet of silver and onyx sat on his brow, the crown of the vampire kings. But it was his expression, as he saw her, that made Ilara's breath catch. He looked at her as if she were something precious, as if she were the only person in the room. The ceremony began with words spoken in an ancient language Ilara didn't understand. a vampire priest, intoning blessings or curses, or perhaps both. Then Lucian spoke, his voice carrying through the hall. I, Lucian Draven, King of Nocturna, Sovereign of the Night, take Ilara of Astoria as my wife, my queen, my equal in all things. I pledge to protect her, honor her, and shelter her under my power for as long as she will have me, by blood and bone, by shadow and starlight. I bind myself to her. The words sent shivers down Ilara's spine. Then it was her turn, and Lady Seraphine whispered the words she should speak. I, Ilara of Astoria, Princess of the Dawn Kingdoms, take Lucien Draven as my husband, my king, my partner in all things. I pledge to stand with him, to see him truly, and to share in both the light and darkness of his reign, by blood and bone, by shadow and starlight. I bind myself to him. The priest produced a silver knife, and Ilara's heart hammered. She'd been warned about this part, but knowing didn't make it easier. Lucien held out his hand, palm up, and the priest made a shallow cut across it. Dark blood welled, but instead of dripping, it seemed to shimmer with an inner light. Then the priest turned to Ilara. Your hand, Your Highness? Ilara offered her hand without trembling, though she wanted to snatch it back. The blade was cold against her skin, the pain sharp and bright. Her blood, red and human, pooled in her palm. The priest guided their hands together, pressing palm to palm, blood mingling. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. Power surged through the connection, Lucien's ancient magic recognizing her humanity, binding them in a way that went beyond mere words. Ilara gasped, her knees buckling, but Lucien's other hand caught her waist, steadying her. I have you, he murmured, too low for anyone else to hear. Breathe through it. It will pass. She focused on his voice, on the solid presence of him, and gradually the overwhelming sensation faded to something almost bearable. When she opened her eyes, she saw that their clasped hands glowed with a soft silver light, sealing the bond. It is done, the priest announced. They are wed, joined in the sight of all courts, bound by blood and oath. Let none challenge this union. Lucian pulled her close and lifted her veil with his free hand. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. Two people from different worlds, now tied together by forces neither fully controlled. Then he leaned down and kissed her. It was gentle, almost chaste, nothing like the passionate embraces described in the romance novels Ilara had secretly read as a girl. But it sent warmth flooding through her, and when he pulled back, she saw surprise in his eyes, as if he'd felt it too. The hall erupted in applause and cheers from both vampires and humans, and Ilara realized it was done. She was married. She was a queen. The feast that followed was awkward, as she'd expected. The vampires drank from crystal goblets that definitely didn't contain wine, while the humans picked at their food and tried not to stare. Ilara sat beside Lucian at the high table, aware of every eye in the room watching them, judging, assessing. How is your hand? Lucian asked quietly. Ilara looked down. The cut had been bandaged with silk, though she could feel the sting of it. It will heal? Yes. He showed her his own palm, where the cut had already closed, leaving only a thin silver scar. Mine healed immediately, but the mark remains, a reminder of the bond. He paused. Can you feel it? The connection? Ilara concentrated, and yes, there was something there. A thread of awareness that let her sense his presence even when she wasn't looking at him. A whisper of his emotions at the edge of her consciousness. Yes, she breathed. Is it always like this? It will fade somewhat over time, but it will never disappear entirely. Vampire marriages are not easily broken. The blood bond ensures that. He studied her face. Does it disturb you? I don't know yet, Ilara said honestly. Ask me again later. His lips quirked. You say that often. Because I rarely know how I feel about anything in this place immediately. Everything requires time to process. Then I will give you time. The feast continued late into the night. Ilara danced with ambassadors and vampire lords, smiled until her face hurt, and played the part of the happy bride. Through it all, she felt Lucian's awareness of her through the bond, a steady presence that was oddly comforting. When she finally began to tire, when the room started to spin from too much wine and too much stress, he was at her side immediately. I think my queen has had enough festivities for one evening, he announced to the room, his voice brooking no argument. We thank you all for attending, but the hour grows late. There were knowing looks from the vampires, ribald jokes from some of the drunker humans, and Ilara's cheeks burned. But Lucian simply offered her his arm and led her from the hall, his presence scattering the well-wishers like a wave dispersing sand. He walked her to her chambers, her old chambers, she realized, not his rooms in the North Tower. At the door, he stopped. You'll sleep here tonight, he said, and tomorrow night, and as many nights as you need. I meant what I said about not forcing anything beyond what the treaty requires. The marriage is political, Ilara. The rest is up to us to figure out. Relief and something else, disappointment, warred in Ilara's chest. Where will you sleep? I have chambers in the North Tower, and I require far less sleep than you do. I'll be fine. He lifted her bandaged hand and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, a gesture so courtly and old-fashioned it made her heart skip. Good night, my queen. I hope you can rest. Good night, my king. She watched him walk away for the second time, and as she entered her chambers, she realized she was crying, not from sadness or fear, but from the overwhelming strangeness of it all. She'd married a vampire king who treated her like glass that might shatter, who gave her space and time when she'd expected demands and cruelty. She'd bound herself to a man she barely knew, but was beginning to understand might be more complex than any person she'd ever met. Margot helped her out of the wedding gown and into a nightdress, then brushed her hair until the elaborate braids were undone. Are you all right, my lady? Margot asked softly. I don't know, Ilara whispered. I think I might be. And that's the strangest thing of all. The next week settled into an unexpected rhythm. Ilara spent her days exploring the castle and its grounds, reading in the library, and learning the ways of the vampire court from Lady Seraphine. She discovered that vampire society was far more complex than she'd imagined, with strict hierarchies, ancient laws, and political factions that made human court intrigue seem simple by comparison. Lucien was often busy with matters of state, meeting with his council, handling disputes between vampire houses, coordinating their armies to patrol the borders against the creatures from the Shadowlands. But he made time for her every evening, joining her for dinner and conversation. They talked about everything: history, philosophy, the nature of power and responsibility. He told her stories of the world as it had been centuries ago, of places that no longer existed and wonders she could barely imagine. What was it like? Ilara asked one evening, a month into their marriage. Becoming what you are? Lucian was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. They'd taken to dining in the library, which felt more intimate than the formal rooms. Terrifying, he finally said. I was 28 when I was turned, a soldier in a war I barely understood. I was dying from a wound that should have killed me immediately, and a vampire found me on the battlefield. She offered me a choice: die as I was, or live as something else. I chose life. I didn't fully understand what that meant. Do you regret it? Sometimes. He turned to look at her. Living for centuries means watching everyone you love die. It means seeing empires crumble, seeing humanity repeat the same mistakes over and over. It means being alone in ways that are difficult to explain. But it also means seeing wonders, learning and growing in ways mortals never can. It's both a gift and a curse. Would you change me? The question slipped out before Ilara could stop it. If I asked? Lucian's expression became pained. No. Why not? Because I would never wish this existence on someone I care about. Immortality isn't the blessing it seems, Ilara. It's an endless road with no destination, and I walk it because I have no choice. But you have the gift of a finite life. Your moments matter because they end. Your choices have weight because your time is precious. I would never take that from you. The intensity in his voice made her throat tight. Even if it meant keeping me with you. Especially then. He reached across the table and took her hand, his touch cool but gentle. I would rather have you for a human lifetime, knowing you lived fully and died peacefully, than trap you in this eternal twilight with me. That's not love, Ilara. That's selfishness. She turned her hand in his, lacing their fingers together. You care about me. It wasn't quite a question, but he answered anyway. Yes, more than I expected to. More than I should, perhaps, given how little time we've known each other. I care about you too, Ilara admitted, her heart racing. I didn't want to. I tried not to. But you're not what I expected, Lucian. You're not the monster from the stories. You're just a man who's lived too long and tried too hard to protect everyone but himself. He laughed, the sound bitter and warm at once. You see too clearly. Or you hide too poorly. They sat like that for a while, hands joined across the table, the fire crackling in the silence. It was Lucian who finally pulled away, though his expression suggested he didn't want to. It's late, he said. You should rest. But as the weeks turned into months, those evening conversations grew longer, more intimate. Lucienne began showing her parts of the castle she hadn't seen. The observatory on the highest tower where they could watch the stars, the underground hot springs heated by volcanic vents, the hidden garden where roses bloomed in impossible colours. He taught her to play chess with pieces carved from crystal and obsidian, and though she lost more often than she won, she treasured the time. And slowly, carefully, they began to touch. A hand on her shoulder as he passed, his arm around her waist when they walked through the gardens, her fingers brushing his hair back from his face when they sat close reading. Each touch was deliberate, questioned silently and answered, building trust and something deeper between them. It was 3 months into their marriage when everything changed. Ilara was in the library late one evening, absorbed in a treatise on ancient magic, when she heard raised voices from the corridor. She recognized one as Lucien's, sharp with anger she'd never heard from him before. You overstep, Mordecai. I speak truth, my king. The second voice was cold, aristocratic. The human queen weakens you. The court sees it. You spend your evenings with her instead of attending to your duties. You refuse audiences to moon over a mortal who will be dust before the century turns. Careful. Lucian's voice dropped to something dangerous. You speak of my wife, of your queen. She is not my queen. She is a political tool who has outlived her usefulness. The treaty is signed, the alliance sealed. We no longer need her. Ilara's blood ran cold. She moved closer to the door, which stood slightly ajar. What are you suggesting? Lucian's words were precise, controlled, but she could feel his rage through the bond. An accident. A tragedy. Humans are so fragile after all. And once she's gone, you can take a proper mate. The Lady Vivienne has been waiting centuries. The sound of impact cut off his words. Ilara reached the door in time to see Lucian holding another vampire against the wall by his throat, feet dangling off the ground. The vampire, Mordecai apparently, clawed at Lucian's hand, but the king didn't budge. "Let me be absolutely clear," Lucian said, his voice quiet and more terrifying for it. "If anything happens to Ilara, if she suffers so much as a paper cut by suspicious means, I will personally hunt down everyone involved and make examples of them that will be whispered about for the next 1,000 years. She is under my protection. She is my wife. And she is your queen. You will treat her as such, or you will find yourself without a head. Do we understand each other?" Mordecai managed a strangled, "Yes, my lord." Lucian released him, and the vampire crumpled to the floor, gasping. "Get out of my sight, and tell your co-conspirators that this is the only warning they'll receive." Mordecai fled, and Lucian stood there, chest heaving with unnecessary breaths, hands clenched into fists. It was only when Ilara stepped through the doorway that he looked up, and the rage in his eyes transformed instantly to concern. "How much did you hear?" "Enough." Ilara's voice was steadier than she felt. "There are vampires in your court who want me dead." "Yes." He moved toward her, then stopped, as if afraid his anger might frighten her. "I knew there was discontent, but I didn't realize they'd grown bold enough to speak openly about it. Ilara, I swear to you." "I know." She closed the distance between them, placing her hand on his chest. "I heard what you said. I felt it. Through the bond. You meant every word." "Of course I did." His hand came up to cover hers. "You're not just a political alliance anymore. You haven't been for a long time." "What am I then?" He looked at her, really looked at her, and she saw everything in his eyes. The loneliness, the hope, the fear of losing something precious he'd only just found. "You're the first person in 300 years who's made me want to be more than just a king, who's made me remember what it feels like to be human." Ilara's breath caught. "Lucienne." "I'm in love with you," he said, the words tumbling out as if he'd been holding them back too long. "I didn't plan for it, didn't want it, knew it was foolish given our circumstances. But I am, completely, irrevocably in love with you." Joy and terror warred in Ilara's heart. "I love you too," she whispered. "God help me, I love you." He kissed her then, and it was nothing like their chaste wedding kiss. This was desperate and deep. 3 months of restrained longing finally unleashed. Ilara's hands fisted in his coat, pulling him closer, and his arms wrapped around her as if he could shield her from the whole world, through sheer force of will. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Lucian pressed his forehead to hers. "Come with me," he murmured. "Please. I don't want you alone tonight, not with threats circling." Ilara nodded, and for the first time, he led her to the North Tower. His chambers were not what she expected. She'd imagined something Gothic and austere, all stone and shadows. Instead, she found a space that felt almost cozy. A massive bed with deep blue hangings, bookshelves overflowing with volumes, a fireplace large enough to stand in, and windows that opened onto a balcony overlooking the mountains. There was art on the walls, instruments in one corner, and the general, comfortable clutter of someone who actually lived in the space rather than just occupied it. I spend most of my time here, Lucian admitted, looking almost shy. It's the one place in the castle that's truly mine. Ilara walked to a shelf and picked up a small wooden horse, clearly a child's toy worn smooth with age. What's this? My son's. The words were quiet, heavy with old grief. From my mortal life. He died of fever when he was 6. That was all I had left of him. She set it down carefully, reverently. I'm sorry. It was a long time ago. Sometimes I have to remind myself that it was real, that I was once a father, a husband, a human man with a human life. He moved to stand behind her, not touching, but close. And then you came, and suddenly I remembered what it felt like to hope for a future instead of just enduring an endless present. Ilara turned to face him. What do we do about Mordecai and the others? I'll handle them, quietly but firmly. His jaw set. They need to understand that you are not negotiable. But Ilara, you need to be careful. Stay in public areas, don't go anywhere without guards. I can't. His voice cracked slightly. I can't lose you. You won't. She reached up to cup his face, feeling the cool smoothness of his skin. We're bound, remember? Blood and bone, shadow and starlight. I'm not going anywhere. That night, they simply held each other, lying in his massive bed, while Lucian told her stories of the world as it had been, of wonders and horrors, and everything in between. Ilara fell asleep to the sound of his voice, feeling safer than she had since arriving at Castle Draven. The next morning brought news from Astoria. A messenger arrived bearing her father's seal, and Ilara read the letter in Lucian's study with her husband looking over her shoulder. The situation had worsened. Duke Bastion's rebellion had spread to 3 more provinces, and the creatures from the Shadowlands were growing bolder. But the alliance with Nocturna was working. Lucien's forces had driven back 2 major incursions, and the presence of vampire patrols had stabilized the northern borders. Your father asks if you're being treated well, Lucien said softly, reading the personal section at the letter's end. He says he worries, for you, and hopes the marriage isn't too difficult to bear. Ilara laughed, though her eyes were wet. I should write back and tell him I've fallen in love with a vampire king who collects books and plays chess, and threatens to destroy anyone who harms me. He'll think I've gone mad. Or he'll be relieved that his gamble paid off. Lucienne kissed her temple. Write to him, Ilara. Tell him you're happy. He deserves to know that he didn't sacrifice his daughter for nothing. So she wrote, carefully and honestly, explaining that while the castle was strange and the vampire court was challenging, she was well. She was safe. And, though she kept this part brief, she was loved. She gave the letter to the messenger and watched him ride away, knowing it might be months before she saw her homeland again. As winter approached, bringing longer nights that the vampires revelled in, Ilara found her place in the castle's rhythms. She attended court functions at Lucien's side, learning to navigate vampire politics with the same skills she'd once used for human court. She made alliances with moderate vampires who supported the human-vampire peace, and she avoided Mordecai and his faction as much as possible. But it was in private that her relationship with Lucienne truly flourished. They spent nearly every night together, talking until dawn, or simply existing in comfortable silence. He taught her about vampire culture, the intricacies of their magic, the way their society had evolved over millennia. She taught him about human hope, about the beauty in temporary things, about how mortality made every moment precious. One evening, 4 months into their marriage, Ilara stood on the balcony of Lucien's chambers, watching snow fall on the mountains. She felt him approach before she heard him, the bond between them now so natural she couldn't imagine being without it. "You're cold," he observed, draping a heavy cloak around her shoulders. "A little. But it's beautiful." He wrapped his arms around her from behind, his chin resting on top of her head. "In all my years, I've seen countless winters, but this is the first one that's felt magical rather than merely cold. Because of me? Because of you." He turned her to face him, and his expression was serious. "Ilara, I need to tell you something about the blood bond, about what it means long term." Her stomach tightened. "What is it?" "The bond we share. It's changed you. Nothing dramatic, nothing you'd notice day to day. But you're aging more slowly now. Not by much, perhaps only aging 1 year for every 2 or 3 that pass. It's a side effect of being bound to a vampire, especially one as old and powerful as I am." Ilara stared at him, processing this. "How much slower?" "I don't know exactly. It varies. But Ilara, you might live 150 years instead of 80, maybe more." He looked pained. "I should have told you before the wedding, but I didn't fully realize the extent of it, myself, until recently. I'm sorry." She thought about this, about having more time with him, about the implications. "So I'll still age, still die, just later." "Yes, you'll still be human, still mortal, just with more time." He cupped her face. "Is that all right? I know it changes things." "Lucien." She smiled, tears pricking her eyes. "You're telling me I get more years with you? How could I possibly be upset about that?" Relief washed over his features. "I was afraid you'd feel trapped, or changed against your will." "I feel loved," she said simply, "and given a gift I didn't know I wanted until now." He kissed her then, soft and sweet and full of promise. And that night, for the first time, they truly became husband and wife in more than name, sharing themselves completely in the privacy of his chambers while snow fell outside and the fire burned low. The winter months passed in a kind of dream. Ilara had never been happier, despite the strangeness of her situation. She and Lucian grew closer each day, learning each other's rhythms, each other's needs. He introduced her to vampire traditions, the winter solstice celebration where they released lanterns into the sky, the festival of remembrance where they honored their dead, the quiet ceremonies that had nothing to do with blood or violence and everything to do with culture and community. But peace never lasted forever. It was a cold February night when the attack came. Ilara was in the library, reading by lamplight, when she felt Lucien's alarm through the bond. She was on her feet immediately, just as Lady Seraphine burst through the door. "Your Majesty, you need to come with me now. The castle is under attack." "What? By whom?" "We don't know. Creatures from the Shadowlands, but they got past all our defenses. The king is fighting them in the Great Hall, but there are too many." Ilara didn't wait to hear more. She ran, following Seraphine through corridors that echoed with screams and the clash of steel. The bond pulled her toward Lucian, toward danger, and she couldn't have stayed away if she tried. The Great Hall was chaos. Creatures that looked like shadows given teeth and claws were everywhere, fighting against vampire guards who were falling back despite their superior strength. And in the center of it all was Lucien, his eyes blazing gold, power radiating from him in visible waves as he fought. He was magnificent and terrifying in equal measure, moving too fast to track, tearing through the shadow creatures with hands that had become claws. This was the monster from the stories, the predator who had ruled for 3 centuries. But he was also the man Ilara loved, fighting desperately to protect his people. She saw it before he did, a creature larger than the others, slipping through the chaos toward his unprotected back. Without thinking, Ilara grabbed a sword from a fallen guard and ran forward, screaming his name. Lucian turned, but too slowly. The creature lunged, and Ilara threw herself between them. The claws raked across her shoulder and side, pain exploding through her body. She heard Lucien roar, felt his rage and terror through the bond like a physical force. Then she was falling, the world spinning, darkness creeping in at the edges of her vision. Strong arms caught her. No, no, no. Lucien's voice, desperate and broken. Ilara, stay with me. Please, stay with me. She tried to speak, but blood filled her mouth. The wounds were bad. She could feel that much. Fatal, probably. I can save you, Lucian said, his face hovering above hers. But you have to choose. Ilara, I need you to choose. She understood what he was asking. The same choice he'd been given on that battlefield centuries ago. Die as she was, or live as something else. Through the pain, she thought of her father, her kingdom, her human life. She thought of children she'd never have, of growing old naturally, of all the human experiences she'd be giving up. Then she thought of Lucian, of the love they'd built, of the work they'd started together to unite their peoples. She thought of having time, real time, to see it through. Yes, she whispered. Choose life. Choose you. Always you. His eyes filled with tears. She'd never seen him cry before. I'm sorry, he whispered. I'm so sorry. Then his fangs descended, and he bit. The pain was overwhelming at first, her body fighting against the transformation even as it fought to heal the wounds that were killing her. She felt Lucian's blood on her lips. He'd cut his wrist, was feeding her even as he drained her, and the taste was like liquid fire and honey and starlight all at once. The world dissolved into sensation. Every nerve ending burned. Every cell rewrote itself. She could feel her heart slowing, hear things she'd never heard before, smell the blood and fear and magic saturating the air. It was too much, far too much, and she would have screamed if she could have found her voice. And then, finally, it stopped. Ilara opened her eyes that now saw in the darkness as clearly as in daylight, and looked up at Lucian. He was watching her with a mixture of relief, love, and deep sorrow. I'm sorry, he said again, his voice breaking. I couldn't let you die. I know you said you didn't want this, but I couldn't. She reached up and pressed her fingers to his lips, silencing him. Around them, the battle was over, the shadow creatures defeated or fled. Vampire guards were securing the hall, tending to the wounded. But all Ilara could focus on was her husband. You saved me, she said, and her voice sounded different, clearer, stronger. Thank you. But I took your humanity, your mortality, everything you valued about being human. Ilara sat up slowly, testing her new body. The wounds were gone, healed completely. She felt stronger than she ever had, more alive in this undeath than she'd been in life. But she also felt the weight of eternity settling on her shoulders, the understanding that everything had changed. You gave me a choice, she said finally, and I chose you. I chose this life, whatever it looks like now. She cupped his face, forcing him to meet her eyes. Don't apologize for that. I regret nothing. Tears streaked down his face, and she tasted them when she kissed him, copper and salt and grief. But also love, so much love it made her chest ache. The next days were difficult as Ilara adjusted to her new existence. Everything was amplified, Sounds, smells, sensations. She could hear conversations 3 rooms away, could smell the fear on humans who passed her in the corridors. And the hunger. God, the hunger was a constant burning in her throat that nothing seemed to satisfy. Lucian stayed with her constantly those first weeks, teaching her control, helping her navigate the overwhelming sensory input. He taught her to hunt animals in the forest rather than humans, showed her how to take just enough from willing donors without harming them, helped her learn to exist in this new skin. "It gets easier," he promised one evening, as she sat trembling after feeding for the first time from a human volunteer, a vampire servant who'd offered his wrist with easy grace. "The hunger becomes background noise eventually. You learn to live with it." "How long did it take you?" "A decade." He smiled wryly at her expression. "But you're stronger than I was, and you have me to guide you. I had to figure it all out alone." Slowly, Ilara adapted. She learned to move through the castle without breaking things, to speak without her voice carrying to every corner, to exist without constantly being overwhelmed. And as her control grew, she began to appreciate the gifts that came with her transformation. She was faster, stronger, able to defend herself in ways she never could have as a human. She could see art and beauty in ways mortal eyes couldn't perceive, could hear music in its full complexity, could experience pleasure and joy with an intensity that made her previous life seem muted by comparison. But most importantly, she had time. Time to build the alliance between humans and vampires into something real and lasting. Time to rule beside Lucian and help shape their kingdoms into something better. Time to love and be loved without the shadow of mortality hanging over every moment. 3 months after her transformation, a delegation arrived from Astoria. Her father had finally come to visit, accompanied by advisors and guards, and a healthy amount of anxiety. Ilara stood beside Lucian in the courtyard, dressed in the black and silver of vampire royalty, and watched her father's face as he saw what she'd become. For a moment, he looked devastated. Then he seemed to gather himself, stepping forward and bowing. "Your Majesty." "Father." Ilara moved to embrace him, carefully controlling her new strength. "I'm still me. I'm still your daughter." He pulled back, studying her face. "Your eyes," he said softly. "They're gold now, like his." "A side effect of the bond," Lucian explained, moving to stand beside them. "When a mated pair are both vampires, their eyes reflect each other. It's unusual, but not unheard of." "What happened?" her father asked. "The letter said only that there was an attack, that you were gravely wounded." So Ilara told him everything. The shadow creatures, the choice she'd made, the weeks of learning to be something new. She watched emotions play across his face. Grief for her lost humanity, relief that she lived, and finally acceptance. "You're happy," he said at last. "That's what matters. I can see it in you, even with these changes. You're happy." "I am," Ilara confirmed. "More than I ever thought possible when I left Astoria." Her father turned to Lucien. "You love her." "More than my own existence," Lucien replied without hesitation. "And you'll keep her safe? Even from herself, if necessary? Because she has a tendency to throw herself into danger for others." Lucien's lips quirked. "I've noticed. And yes, I will protect her from all threats, including her own heroic impulses." "Hey," Ilara protested, but she was smiling. Her father stayed for 2 weeks, and in that time, Ilara saw his opinion of Lucien and the vampire court gradually shift. He saw how the kingdom was run with justice and wisdom, how the people, both vampire and human servants, were treated with respect. He watched Lucian and Alara work together on treaties and trade agreements, saw the way they complemented each other. On his last evening, he pulled Alara aside. "I was wrong about him," he admitted. "About all of them, really. I sent you here expecting you to be a prisoner in all but name, a sacrifice for the greater good. Instead, I see a queen who's found her place and a partnership that might actually change the world." "It's not perfect," Ilara said honestly. "There are still vampires who resent the alliance, still humans who fear us. But we're trying. That's what matters." "Keep trying," her father said, "and write to me. Let me know how you're doing, even if you'll live long enough to read my great-great-grandchildren's letters." The thought made Alara's chest tight. "I will. I promise." After her father left, life settled into new patterns. Ilara took on more responsibilities in running the kingdom, using her unique position as both former human and current vampire to bridge the two worlds. She worked with Lady Seraphine to establish programs that helped human villages near vampire territories, created treaties that protected both species, and slowly began to change the way humans and vampires saw each other. Mordecai and his faction made one more attempt at undermining her authority, spreading rumors that she was an abomination, that her transformation had been against vampire law. But Lucian shut that down decisively, banishing 3 of the worst offenders and making it clear that any further challenges to his queen would be met with permanent consequences. "They're afraid," Lucienne explained one evening as they walked through the night garden. "Afraid of change, of what it means that a human could become one of us and still retain her humanity, her compassion. You represent everything they've convinced themselves isn't possible." "What do you think I represent?" Ilara asked. He stopped, turning to face her in the moonlight. "Hope. The possibility that we don't have to be monsters, that we can be more than our nature dictates. You make me want to be better, Ilara. You always have. From the moment you walked into my receiving room and told me the truth was somewhere between the stories and the man." "I love you," she said, the words still sending a thrill through her every time she spoke them. "For everything you are, and everything you're trying to become. And I love you." He pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "My brave, stubborn, impossible queen. My partner in every sense of the word." Years passed. Decades, eventually. Ilara's father died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78, and she mourned him with the intensity of someone who understood exactly what had been lost. She watched Margot grow old and then pass, surrounded by family and loved ones. She saw her homeland change and grow, sometimes for better and sometimes for worse, and she helped guide it where she could. The alliance between humans and vampires grew stronger, though it was never without its challenges. There were setbacks and conflicts, moments when it seemed like everything would crumble. But Ilara and Lucian stood firm, 2 leaders united by love and purpose, refusing to let the peace they'd built fall apart. They had children eventually, though it took many years, and vampire pregnancies were rare and difficult. A daughter with Ilara's courage and Lucien's wisdom, a son with his father's strategic mind and his mother's compassion. They raised them to understand both worlds, to value both human innovation and vampire tradition. And through it all, Ilara and Lucien's love deepened. It wasn't the wild, desperate passion of those early months, though that fire never fully died. Instead, it became something richer, more complex. They knew each other completely, understood each other's darkness and light. They argued and made up, challenged each other and supported each other. grew together in ways that only immortals could. On the 100th anniversary of their wedding, they stood on the balcony of Lucien's chambers, their chambers now truly shared, and looked out over the kingdom they'd built together. "Do you regret it?" Lucien asked quietly. "Becoming what you are? Giving up your human life?" Ilara considered the question seriously, as she always did when he asked. He'd asked it many times over the years, needing reassurance that she hadn't come to resent the choice he'd forced on her in that moment of desperation. "Sometimes I miss the simplicity of mortality," she admitted. "The way humans can live in the moment without the weight of centuries pressing down on them. I miss my father and Margot and the people I loved who are gone now. But," he sensed there was more, "but I wouldn't trade this life for anything." She turned to face him, taking his hands. "I get to spend eternity with you. I get to see our children grow and have their own children. I get to keep working on making the world better, keep building bridges between species and cultures. The good outweighs the hard parts 1,000 times over." Lucien pulled her into his arms, holding her close. "I was so afraid when we first met. Afraid of caring, of losing someone else, of opening myself up to that kind of pain again. You terrified me from the moment I saw you. Because I knew you were going to change everything." "Did I?" "Completely." He smiled against her hair. "You took a monster who'd forgotten what it meant to hope and reminded him that he was still capable of love. You took a vampire king who'd resigned himself to eternal solitude and gave him a family, a true partner. You changed me, Ilara, made me better than I was." "We changed each other," she corrected. "That's what love does." They stood like that for a long time, two immortals who'd found each other against all odds, who'd built something lasting and true from what had begun as a political arrangement. The moon rose over the mountains, casting silver light on the castle that had become home, and somewhere in the distance, their children were laughing. Ilara thought about the princess she'd been 100 years ago, terrified and alone in a carriage heading toward what she'd thought was her doom. That girl could never have imagined the life waiting for her. The love, the power, the purpose. She couldn't have conceived of becoming a vampire queen who ruled with both strength and compassion, who stood as a bridge between two worlds. But Ilara was glad that girl had been brave enough to step out of the carriage anyway. Glad she'd been willing to look past the stories and see the man behind the monster. Glad she'd chosen hope over fear, love over safety. "What are you thinking?" Lucien asked. "That I'd do it all again," Ilara said. "Every moment, every choice, every challenge. I'd do it all again just to end up here, with you." He kissed her then, soft and sweet and full of promise. And as the stars wheeled overhead and the centuries stretched before them, Ilara knew with absolute certainty that she'd found what she'd been searching for without even knowing it. Not a political alliance or a marriage of convenience, but a true partnership. A love that transcended the boundaries between life and death, between human and vampire, between what was and what could be. She'd been sent to marry a monster, and had found a man worth becoming a monster for. And in the end, they'd both discovered they were never monsters at all. Just two people trying to do better, to be better, together. That was more than enough. It was everything.